Lord, yes, papi, hit me one time and make it funky.
I was brought up and told to have no fear. I was brought up and told to have no fear. I was brought up and told to have no fear.
Welcome to the Full Circle Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, David Roberts, along with the OG Dr. Neil Holmes and the oral historian, Andre Taylor. Gentlemen, we don't have a guest today, but we have a variety of topics I wanted to discuss, some that you've discussed as well. Dre, let's start with you at your university. You guys are building a memorial.
Yeah, so they hope to have it built before homecoming, which is in October this year. It's a memorial that's built to the enslaved Blacks that were here at the College of William and Mary. Several donors, board of visitors contributed to make this a reality. And on Wednesday, the wall that was built during the time when the Rockefellers wanted to refurbish colonial Williamsburg, they put this wall in place around the campus. So a portion of the wall was torn down Wednesday at a ceremony, and the rest of the wall will come down. And in lieu of the wall, there will be this monument that's going to be an open structure to the public, and it'll list the names of the enslaved people that were here and the 107 that there aren't names for. So it was pretty cool to be there. The university brought out some of the first Blacks to attend William and Mary. Two of the three first Black women in residence were here, and it was amazing to see them, because it's just like, your efforts, and I guess I would consider them to be civil rights people, because they fought for the right to attend this school, even though it was in the late 1960s. They still were here to say we belong. So it was good to see them, and it's good to see the university move in a direction to recognize the enslaved people who, for the most part, helped build some of the original structures that we have here on campus.
So the fact that some of the first Blacks to attend William and Mary are still alive, I guess that indicates that it wasn't that long ago when they admitted the first Black students.
Yeah, so it's late 60s, I think it was 67, I want to say, 67, 68, somewhere in there. Three women were allowed to live on campus, and there were three black males as well, but they could not live on campus. So they were commuters. And just the thought of that, the fact that we weren't allowed on campus. You don't see the first Black on campus until, I believe it was the early 70s, and he played football. So.
And I guess it's easy to forget, me being in Northern Virginia, closer to DC, and it's like two different worlds. You forget that just an hour and a half south of me was Richmond, Virginia, which was the Confederate capital. And this was a Confederate state, but living up here, you can forget that easily, So, I think that's after Old Miss. Had Mr. Meredith, admitted into their university. So that's interesting. And while we're talking about, in a way, trying to make amends for certain things, let's talk about the Viola Fletcher story. And I think I'm pronouncing her name right. Is Viola Fletcher, 107 years old, survivor of the 1921 Tulsa race massacre. She was on Capitol Hill, still testifying that we need some type of reparations for that. It's just amazing that, however old she was at the time, that trauma, I would imagine, has stayed with her all these years. Dr. Holmes, what are your thoughts on this? Because I think you were one of the first ones that taught me about the 1921 and Black Wall Street, because it wasn't something that was talked about a lot.
I think, this is the fact that the community has continued to maintain that history. And it shows actually the importance of history, the things that Andre is doing in terms of maintaining history and bringing back those things that have been attempted to be covered over. I think this tremendous. The thing we have to remember is that the massacre that occurred in 1921 was a continuation from the Red Summer of 1919, where you had probably, you had, a couple of, about dozens of similar massacres all across the country. This occurred after World War I, where white soldiers coming back from the war are going to make certain that Black folks have not taken their place, so to speak, as those folks said in Charlottesville, you will not replace us. They were trying to make sure that African people would not replace them. I just have one thing I want to mention here, that in addition to those more well-known cases, the Associated Press, the AP, back in, what year was this? Back in the 90s, did an 18-month study, and based on 1,000 interviews that they did of African people in this country who had talked about having their land stolen. And I'm just going to read a couple of sentences here. In an investigation that included interviews with more than 1,000 people and the examination of tens of thousands of public records in county courthouses and state and federal archives, this study documented 107 land takings in 13 southern and border states. In those cases alone, 406 Black landowners lost more than 24,000 acres of farm and timberland, plus 85 smaller properties, including stores and city lots. Today, virtually all of this property, valued at tens of millions of dollars, is owned by whites or by corporations. And this is, and after this study, there was another more in-depth study that was published in a book that looked at this. So that's one thing. When I was coming up, we learned about this a little bit in the Black schools, in the so-called segregated schools, but not in great detail. And later we learned more, and you could always hear these things talked about by some of the elders in the community about land loss. But later when I went to college and learned words and things like that, I learned this term pogrom, which referred to Jews as losing their homes and being run away from their land and so forth in Eastern Europe. But I didn't learn until well in my adulthood that there was such a thing as bulldozing or white capping, which were the terms used when Black folks were chased off of their land and land was taken from them in this country, often in the South, but also in the Midwest of the country. So we had this term called white capping, bulldozing. And interestingly enough, people in Tulsa, Oklahoma, there are something like 50 Black towns that remained more or less in Oklahoma that were the results of Blacks moving out to that area, trying to create, for many of them, trying to create a Black state, some in Kansas trying to do the same thing. And many of those people who moved to Oklahoma had in fact been chased off of their land as a result of white capping, and were attempting to settle Black towns and so forth to rebuild again.
I think what's so interesting about any of those riots, but especially this one, is that whenever you talk about the statistics, economic, social economic, so on and so forth, conservative pundits always say, well, those people need to work hard and they need to, do this and stop, begging us for this and begging us for that. And the community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, they were totally self-sufficient. They had gone on and did what conservative pundits say they should do. They built up their own communities. And it was just so interesting that this white mob was so offended, that these Black people dared prosper, that they felt the need to, come and, destroy what they had built. And I don't think it was a matter of competing. I don't think they were like, people importing goods and selling them to the Black community and wouldn't sell them to that. I don't think it was about competing for anything. They just did not want to see this Black community prosper, you know. And then when you talk about reparations, it's interesting. I used to think that reparations was a kind of like a out of bounds, not something that we would never see. But then when Ronald Reagan signed the reparations for the Japanese that were detained during World War II,
Yeah.
you know, I thought, okay, so this is something that does happen. It seems like it just doesn't happen for us. You know, even the recent Asian anti-discrimination bill, which I have no problem with, but we've been, you know, trying to get this anti-lynching bill for Black people for years, and that just seems like that's not going to happen. So it's just, you know, just very interesting. I don't know if either of you have an additional comment on that.
Both of you bring up two great points that intersect with research that I've done. Dr. Holmes talking about the land that was taken in the AP article you're talking about in the 90s. I read that as part of some research that I had done looking in South Carolina, pretty much following the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor. And you look at an article that was done in 2001, and there was almost double the amount of land taken from the 1990s article. And it's ridiculous when you think about when you're working with descendant communities and looking at heirs property. You know, people say that, you know, we as Black people don't believe in leaving something behind for, you know, the generations behind us. And it's not true all the time. Sometimes it's been taken from us because there's a loophole. You know, somebody dies and we didn't put your name on, but your mother's name is on the heirs list. And she put in a will that any property of hers is yours, but didn't name you specifically, probably because you weren't born yet. And all of a sudden there's that loophole where there's no heir to attach to. So now the state doesn't recognize you as the owner in certain southern states. They retain the land, they sell it in auction, some developer buys it. Next thing you know, a strip mall comes up on the land that should have been yours. You know, so we've seen this happen over and over again. And in terms of what you talked about, with the different bills that are in place, the question that came in mind to me, and it was a discussion a couple of weeks ago with some friends, does the US sign bills with foreign countries to give reparations to make sure that there's trade in place? So you look at Japan and you look at the United States. You know, World War II, we know exactly what happened in World War II. Japan influenced the US to get into the war, although Roosevelt wanted to get in anyway. Pearl Harbor was the point where they said, okay, we're definitely in now. And it was a Japanese bombing attack of Pearl Harbor. Years later, and I'm doing research on the first Japanese American football player here at William and Mary that they're going to name something on campus for sometime soon. But you have that person who almost missed his father's funeral because depending on where you were in America at the time of World War II, if you were Japanese, you had restrictions on your travel. If you were east of the Mississippi, it was a little easier. Anything west of the Mississippi, huge problem. At that point, you could be put into an internment camp. Fast forward, and you look at the trade between the US and Japan today, was that not done to make sure that trade existed? With Black people, what country are we signing? You'd have to sign pretty much the entire west coast of Africa and some of Central Africa to say, all right, we covered all our bases now. You know, now we can resume trade. But there's no need for trade because you had something that was called a scramble for Africa, where all those countries was divvied up, and all of a sudden things were taken, all the resources were taken out. So it's just like, you know, sorry, that was years ago. And that's the excuse that you hear. I watched the interview the other night that was talking about the Tulsa race riots, and it was said, well, nobody that was alive then is alive now, so we shouldn't have to pay for that. You know, that was years ago. And when it comes in terms of Black people, that's always a term, years ago. Slavery, oh, that was years ago. Civil rights, that was years ago. Tulsa, that was years ago. You know, but when you think about it, Harriet Tubman was alive when Thomas Jefferson was alive. She was alive when Ronald Reagan was alive. So how long ago was this when you put it in perspective that way? So I'm tired of hearing the term that was years ago, because years ago for you is yesterday for us.
Right, but also years ago, to me, it just more so emphasizes the reason that we should be paying reparations in certain cases. Like I remember buying my first home in Philadelphia back in, 2000, nothing spectacular, but 5 years later, I sold that home and for a $50,000 profit. Now we were in the midst of kind of like an inflated housing market then, and the crash eventually came. But just think if my great grandfather had land that he was able to pass down to me, and then I could pass that land on to my son, how much would it have appreciated in that time? So when we say long ago, that's just emphasizing, yes, if you took $5 from someone back in 1700s, how much is that $5 worth now? And it's so interesting. You say you hear that argument, and when we had 9/11, when 2,000 people died, 3,000 people died, which was a horrible tragedy, not minimizing that, but it's like we will never forget. We will never forget. But then anything, I guess we're the only ones that are asked to just forget about our pain, and not even just emotional pain. I can get over emotional pain, but when you talk about the economic impact, of things that have been done that still are intact today. Of course, I can't go back and punish a slave owner from 1700s, but we can talk about the economic impact that is still felt today. So next, I wanted to talk about something, Dre, that you had posted on your Facebook page that I saw was interesting. This kind of flies in the same face of what we just talking about. It's all connected. Tenure offer was revoked from the Slavery Project journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones by North Carolina University. For our listeners and viewers, can you give a little of the backstory?
Yeah, so she's the prolific journalist, award-winning journalist, Pulitzer Prize award-winning journalist, who did the Project 1619, which was a deep dive into, and I'll say this historically, the alleged first arrival of Blacks in this country, because there's documentation of Blacks coming before 1619 in Florida. So she did this amazing piece for New York Times, lots of awards, lots of attention, and her project was going to be used as a way of looking at reckoning in America and addressing the issue of race and enslavement in America in schools. A lot of pushback on that. University of North Carolina, which by the way is one of her alma maters, offers her tenure position to be in charge of, I forget the exact title, but investigative reporting at their School of Journalism at University of North Carolina. All of a sudden that gets revoked and they offer her a 5-year stint instead. And the argument that most people are making is, well, it's okay because maybe the rules and regulations weren't followed to give her the tenure. But my question is this just a way of getting her to go away because old white men at the University of North Carolina don't really want to hear about the past? They'd much rather dote on, the whole term of 1776. And I love seeing white people, especially the woman this morning in the store with the shirt on that said, "We the people." And I really want to tell her, no, it was them the people, because you didn't come along until 1912. Know your history, move forward. But it's interesting that they want to bury, and I say they, older white men and institutions want to bury the truth. Most universities are in this period of reckoning where they're addressing institutional enslavement. Some cases they're addressing systemic racism, but for the most part, and I say this strongly about University of North Carolina, it took forever for them to handle the situation with the Silent Sam statue that was on campus, which was a statue that was a generic Confederate monument to the dead, Confederate dead. But I'm also on the side of removing statues without proper context is erasing history. So I say you counter that by erecting statues that add to the full narrative as opposed to just one. University of North Carolina, for some odd reason, just can't figure out how to move forward. And it's supposed to be an institution of higher education, yet you want to block people from learning. So I have strong feelings about what they're doing there.
I had to, when I first heard about her tenure, what was it, the not being denied tenure.
Mhm.
I tried to be objective about it. I was like, okay, maybe she did this award-winning documentary, but maybe she wasn't a great professor, because I had a well-known professor at Temple. He had a great name, but his fame kind of gotten in the way.
Mhm.
And I think we talked about that before. But then as I delved into it a little bit more, they had already offered her the tenure. And then when you create this project, which is documented history, she's not making anything up. She's not railing against anyone saying, white man this, white man that. She just sharing the history that we all know is in place.
Mhm.
Then they wanted to revoke her tenure. And like you, Dre, I just thought that was, over the top. But am I to understand it, Dr. Holmes? I think you said you read some more about it. They're
Well,
backing off of that.
possibly. I don't want to stand on it because it was something I kind of read in passing. But I think the key thing that we have to remember is that generally she was granted tenure through the normal university process by the department and then, by the dean and et cetera. And it was revoked by the board of trustees, which means that they came in, and which is kind of unusual. And this is what's going on now. We see with it's tantamount to the banning of books that we see in Nazi Germany. If you remember the scenes of people throwing those books in a pile and burning them, and people who rail against the council culture or counseling anything that has to do with any kind of criticism or critique that suggests that that somehow this country had practiced systemic racism. So, and it didn't begin just this last couple of years, but we had some years ago in Arizona, the state began to try to make it impossible to teach Chicano studies because they believe that, if you looked at the history of Mexican Americans properly and openly, then somehow you'd be critiquing white folks. So this happened in the public schools in Arizona some years ago. In a similar sense, Texas just passed another law that says, you can't have anything that attempts to somehow criticize whites for doing racist things, in the past. So we have a system that is increasingly, as it's stripping the rights to vote away from, I don't like this term, people of color, I say colonized people. And that's why you can so easily do it. And not only in Republican states, but it's happening in some 40 some states. We've seen restrictions on voting rights, and at the same time, we're seeing restriction on thinking rights and ideas. So this is a negative, but it's also a positive in the sense that we see how important ideas are. It's so important that people will try to ban your ideas. And so it's in some ways, Kwame Ture used to say, you aren't, if the enemy isn't doing anything against you, it means that you aren't doing anything. So when people come and ban your books or ban you, basically it's because you're being effective. And we have to keep up the effectiveness and we have to not merely do these things on the campuses, but we also have to do them in the communities and churches. And we have to, and a lot of this was done in the street during some of these demonstrations. A lot of this consciousness kind of parallel, horizontal communications were going on between groups of people and individuals. So I think this is the Chinese, when they talk about crisis. Yeah, I know you've heard this thing a lot of times. They write it with these two characters. One character saying danger, the other character saying opportunity. So we're in a crisis period. it's a period in which there are a lot of dangers because we have people who are heavily armed, who are willing to commit what we call a push. To some people call it a takeover, uprising, or whatever they call it, on the Capitol building, and the Senate Republicans will cover their actions, so to speak, but it's also a period of opportunity because ideas are being open, minds are being open, and some limited progress is being made in the sense that we are consolidating people around the idea that this country has greater flaws than we had imagined previously, and there needs to be consistent action to change it.
Now, do you think, and we could probably close with this, do you think that the reason some people are so resistant to even address this, and even though they weren't the ones we're looking at, they weren't around 200, 400 years ago, do you think they're just so resistant to address this because they don't want to address the conditions that we've talked about that it led to, like when my great-great-grandfather couldn't pass down land to me, and so I might not be in the same position as my white counterpart whose great-great-grandfather who inherited something from his great-great-great-grandfather? Do you think that's the issue, or is it just a shame, a feeling of shame?
Well, no, I don't know how Dre feels, but I look at this from a material basis.
Mhm.
And I think it was about competition when you talk about
The Tulsa.
Tulsa, yeah, because you're talking about people who had the kind of money that they could loan money to oil men, right? And they, the only Stetson hat dealer for what 500 miles was a black person. So there you control wealth, and so and we have to understand that in the system of enslavement that we experienced in this country, there were two ways to move up if you didn't have much. One way is by theft of Indian land, and another one is by theft of African. And I don't use this this Foucaultian language about black bodies, because it was black mind, black spirit, and all of that stuff that was appropriated in creativity. But one is to rob black folks and to possess blacks. And if you didn't own slaves yourself, you could rent them, lease them, or you could whip them and beat them as an overseer. Well, that hasn't changed. If you want to move up, then you can move in and gentrify the neighborhood and take that land that black folks lived on and triple and quadruple the price and so forth. Or you can, one of the biggest money makers in this country, government land jobs program, are prisons, where you can get a job controlling black folks in these big prisons. They have a thing called $1 billion blocks, and especially in New York. And $1 billion block is a block that sends so many people to prison. That represents about $1 billion upstate New York in terms of jobs and construction and so forth. So you have a political economy that's built on native land and African people and control of those people, so that they cannot, and if they, which is we, own anything, including our ideas, then that the system, that throws a wrench in the system. Last thing I want to make, last little point, the notion that, because Dre was talking about earlier how the Japanese, and they had this inside outside thing in terms of dealing with trade with the Japanese and so forth, as a reason for making some of these things happen in terms of reparations. This is why the Pan-Africanists and many of the Black nationalists have tried to break through the domesticization of our movement and say that our movement has to be international and with a focus Pan-Africanists on these relationships with Africa in order to bring that international dimension to what it is that we're doing.
One last thing, and this is kind of a piggyback off what you just said, Dr. Holmes. Do you feel that's the reason? Because what you just said made me think of something. When during the Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, I don't want to say battle, but they had different ideology, right? And Malcolm X always said, if you want to get too close to that white devil, these were his words. They sick dogs on you and, shoot you with fire hoses, so on and so forth. Then when you talk about separating, like the Nation of Islam was doing, then they're upset with that. So the white segregationists, why didn't they love Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam? Was it because they were separating, but they were developing a sense of pride and economic reciprocity in their community?
Well, my position is that we live in a system, they call it racial. Some people call it racial capitalism. I'm not, I understand what they're trying to say, but I call it, or I follow Nkrumah, which says domestic colonialism, a sort of a system in which we live in a system in which slavery was incorporated in an institutional way in the capitalist system that we live under. So that means that that we still have those factors working against us and working for other people on an everyday basis, and it's so ingrained in the system that you often don't notice it. So and so the idea is not King versus Malcolm. The idea is that any attempt of the enslaved to either change the plantation to something else, to burn it down maybe, or just to change it, transform it, or to flee the plantation. You're just trying to run away, trying to run to freedom. You're not running away, you're running toward freedom. Any of that attempt is met with resistance. And we shouldn't overdo the distance between King and Malcolm, at least especially in the beginning and in the end. When I talk about in the beginning, when King first began, in 1959, King wrote a preface to a book called Negroes with Guns, which was written by Robert Williams, which said that Blacks had a right to defend themselves with arms. And King said, I have no problem with the right to defend ourselves with arms. My problem is that if we're going to go on the offensive, you can go on the offensive more better. You have better able to go on the offense if you do it in a disciplined, nonviolent way. So he used nonviolence to go on the offense as opposed to defense. You're talking about self-defense. Mm-hmm. And so, King, in some ways, King is more progressive than Malcolm around at least until the end. When Malcolm began to see this whole question of class and how it works, because at the end, King was pulling together the same movement that we saw in the movie Judas and the Black Messiah, which was the Rainbow Coalition. Which were these young folks forming this young radical rainbow coalition of many of them from former street gangs. You see King had a same rainbow coalition. Blacks, poor whites from Appalachia, Puerto Ricans, Mexican Americans, Native people, and middle-class whites. He had that same coalition. And that's one of the reasons they had to take him out. Because of that, and because he began to go in a very hard way against the war in Vietnam and some other things. So King, just before he was assassinated, or just before Malcolm was assassinated, I should say, had sent his lawyer to New York to set up a meeting with Malcolm and to figure out how they could work out some arrangement, because there were several things that they agreed upon. A lot of things they disagreed, and that's okay in a movement, because everybody's not doing the same thing. We have to have a multi-form movement. But and those folks were moving in a track that I don't necessarily mean is the same track, but some of the same ideas were going back and forth. And King was a very radical thinker and actor and writer. Malcolm didn't write much, but his ideas, he had a tremendous intellect, and he was actually developing, and some of his ideas influenced. The influence, I should say, the influence of the Nation of Islam, not just Malcolm, but the influence of the Nation of Islam for the left, the Arab left, was tremendous. There was a guy in the Arab, left, I think from Tunisia. These people, we look at them, we think they're mostly white, sort of, and they were saying, back in the day, they were all, when they were waking up to become activists, they were all reading Muhammad Speaks. Mm-hmm. Back in the late, in the late 50s and early 60s. That was what got them into action. So, I don't like to overdo this. Certainly Malcolm and King had differences, but also they were beginning more and more to see the possibility of collaboration, and over time, Malcolm began to learn from King, and King began to learn from Malcolm, although they were moving in different tracks and did not necessarily have the same objective, because they wanted sort of freedom for the people, but how they were going to pursue it and what that freedom, what the content of that freedom, were not necessarily the same thing. But if both of those individuals had been able to live natural lives, if there were about 10, 15 people who hadn't gotten, assassinated or killed around the world, King being one, Malcolm being another, Lumumba being another, Nkrumah being another, Keita being another, and then you have some other forces that people might not be that much aware of. But if those folks have been able to live natural lives, or at least another 20 years of their lives, we would be in a whole different position in this country, in the world as a people.
And that's probably the reason that they weren't able to live, because what was it, J. Edgar Hoover said the biggest threat to America was Negro pride, Negro self-sufficiency, and like Andre and I have said on several occasions, it's hard to follow the OG, Dr. Neil Holmes. So we'll, it's like following Michael Jackson in concert. So we'll go ahead and end it right there. And we just want to, all of you that support us, we want to thank you. For those of you listening to us on the podcast that just get to hear us, please take a second to go to our website, fullcircleshow.com, and then click onto our YouTube page, and you can see us in person, and you can subscribe to that YouTube page. So we'll see you all next time. Thank you.
Lord, yes, papi, hit me one time and make it funky.
I was brought up and told to have no fear.